Hello, everyone. My name is Samarth Thakker, and for my Gardner research project, I focused on the Indian court system and how decisions made by the courts in India impacted people's rights to practice religion during the COVID-19 pandemic. I just want to preface that the bulk of my analysis is on events that took place between March and December of 2020, prior to the spread of the more devastating variant of the virus that impacted India in 2021. To give you a general understanding of the relationship between the Indian government and religion, I want to highlight Article 25 of India's Constitution, which states, subject to public order, morality, and health, all persons are equally entitled to the right to freely practice and propagate religion. As the cases I discuss later will demonstrate, while India's Constitution guarantees the right to practice religion, it limits this practice, because it not only enables the government to intervene in religious affairs, but oftentimes it explicitly requires the state to do so. For example, on the judicial side of the government, judges often have to interpret religious concepts as part of their decisions because so many areas of Indian law take religious identity into serious consideration. When we think about the concept of secularism, we know that in the United States, the religion clauses of the First Amendment build a wall of separation between church and state. But the Indian Constitution interprets secularism in a manner that allows for and even necessitates state involvement in religious affairs. So here's a list of the cases I studied as part of my research, which include judgments made by the Supreme Court, as well as a number of high courts from different states in India. I also referenced the US Supreme Court case regarding religious restrictions in New York to highlight how the stance of judicial authorities in India differ from their American counterparts. In the next few slides, I'm going to present to you some of the questions I had going into this research project and how the judgments delivered by the courts answered these questions. So first, does the government have the right to prohibit religious activity? The courts reference Article 25, which enables the state to regulate or restrict any economic, financial, or secular activity that may be associated with religious practice. One decision made by the High Court states that while religious sentiment of all sections of society must be respected, the right to life and health of the public at large cannot be sacrificed at the altar of a right to celebrate a festival, however significant it may be for a particular community. Evidently, the courts find that the circumstances surrounding COVID-19, rising infection rates, depletion of resources, require the government to prioritize public health over religion, even if it means that the government is acting in contrary to religious sentiment. Which leads to the next critical question. How do the courts define the government's role in combating the public health crisis? The Gujarat High Court began their judgment on the case that I studied with a quote from former President Theodore Roosevelt, who said, "No man is above the law and no man is below it, nor we ask any man's permission when we ask him to obey it. Obedience to the law is demanded as a right, not asked as a favor." In light of this sentiment, the courts hold that the state governments are the main secular body heading the fight against COVID, and therefore they have broad discretion on what restrictions are necessary. However, the courts also observed that the governments were being passive when asserting these restrictions, and the states were choosing to follow a policy of appeasement in order to persuade religious leaders against holding gatherings. This is indicative of some of the rising tensions between the courts and the state governments as a result of COVID-19. The last question I want to talk about is, how has the Indian government treated religious minorities during the pandemic? And to answer this question, I studied the case of the Tablighi Jamaat. The Tablighi Jamaat is a Muslim organization that held a religious congregation in Delhi in March of last year. Over 8,000 members of the Tablighi Jamaat, including foreign nationals, had attended, and this group eventually received widespread criticism due to over 4,000 coronavirus cases being connected to that congregation. Unfortunately, the discovery of this issue led to anti-Muslim rhetoric flooding mainstream media, and there were even accounts of political leaders blaming the Tablighi Jamaat for the rise of infection rates in India. This issue eventually went to the courts when attendees of that congregation were faced with criminal charges. The decision I analyzed pertaining to this issue was from the Bombay High Court, in which a number of foreign nationals were charged with violating the conditions of their tourist visas. The courts eventually decided in support of the members and strongly criticized the government and mainstream media for using this religious group as a scapegoat for the situation in India.